Welcome back, beautiful people. My name is, of course, Michael Granado. If you are joining me for the first time, I am a history and philosophy educator. And in this video, I'm going to be reviewing a conversation that was had on the Deep Drinks podcast between David McDonald, who is the host of Deep Drinks, self-ascribed atheist. I believe, David, forgive me if I'm wrong about that. Last time I checked, David was an atheist, and Michael Jones, who is a Christian apologist. And they're having a conversation regarding this question: is Christianity harmful, both on a societal and individual level? Now, I want to give a quick shout out to both of these people. I've actually interviewed both Michael and David. I interviewed Michael a while back concerning the topic of Christian virtue ethics. Now, I'm partial to virtue ethics as a normative theory, and I had saw a couple of videos that Michael did talking about Christian virtue ethics specifically. So I'll link that interview in the description of this video. And David, I think, has been on my channel 3 or 4 times. If it's not 4 times, David, come back and we'll make it a 4th time. And shout out to David because he has built up Deep Drinks tremendously over the past year. If you haven't done so already, please go check out David's channel. He is a fantastic interviewer and he has interviewed some of the best, everything from YouTube personalities to authors to some of the leading biblical scholars. They had a panel on biblical slavery. And of course, he's interviewed yours truly as well. Go check that out. But yeah, David is good people, and he only paid me like $500 to plug his channel. So, thank you. Shout out to Dave. Make sure he gets his money worth. No, I'm just kidding. So anyway, as with the last debate review that I did, my focus of this video is not going to be so much on the question, is Christianity harmful, but rather some of the responses that were brought up. Now, I'll probably break this into 2 parts, but there were some things that Michael said that I want to focus on. In this video, I'm going to focus on what he said about the relationship between Christianity and slavery. I might do a follow-up video where I focus on his comments with respect to Christianity and Islam. But I don't want to put words in his mouth, so let's go ahead and get into it. This is the argument that Michael gives of why Christianity is actually beneficial to society.
Just show no intrinsic religiosity, Christian religiosity in general, is associated with numerous benefits like self-control, lower levels of aggression, lower levels of depression, lower levels of suicide. It's associated with with good things like care for the environment. It's associated with lower levels of racism. It's associated with a lot of positive benefits.
So intrinsic religiosity, specifically intrinsic Christian religiosity, has all of these wonderful benefits to it, is essentially Michael's argument. He's referencing a video on his channel that I'll also link if you want to go watch it, but this is an objection to the common atheist argument that Christianity is harmful. Now, from this, he's going to mention one of the social benefits, and that was the abolitionist movement. And that is going to kind of shift the conversation to this discussion around slavery. And David's going to give Michael a little pushback, and it's this kind of back and forth that I want to examine here. So let's get back to what Michael was saying.
Are you trying to get rid of something that is so good for society and historically has been very, very good and helpful for building the basis of Western civilization? I'll see a lot of people say, the Bible's pro-slavery. Well, I mean, I could cite several historians that would say the reason why the abolitionist movement was so successful was because it was building on foundations that got from Christianity. We probably would not be as anti-slavery as we are now if it wasn't for Christianity.
Okay, so I'm going to nitpick a lot with this video, and David, Michael, if and when you see this, I apologize. This might be a little pedantic, but so Michael's argument here is that the principles that the abolitionist movement was based out of is kind of coming from Christianity. And he makes this statement that we would not be as anti-slavery as we are if it wasn't for Christianity. And I bring this up because Michael does this several times throughout the conversation. And this is an example of a historical counterfactual. And I bring this up because these statements are essentially, I guess the best way to put it is these are kind of empty claims. There's no way to know or to judge or to validate or sort of invalidate these claims because we don't know what Western society would be like without Christianity, because we only have one case study, and that's Western society as it is now. But let's get back to what Michael's saying here, because I actually want to comment on some of the content that he's going to be referencing with respect to the history of slavery and its relationship to Christianity.
We probably wouldn't have the same robust understanding of human rights if it wasn't for Christianity. So it's just the basis of that video is just to look at the current sociology and then just sort of show how it's associated with all these positive benefits. Right now, I'm doing research to do the historical aspect of that, show how Christianity led to Western civilization and a lot of the positive benefits that we have.
This is another claim or phrase that's brought up throughout the video, that Christianity led to the development of Western civilization, or that Christianity serves as the basis of Western civilization. Now, when people talk about Western civilization like this, it sometimes raises red flags, because, and I'm not saying that Michael's doing this. He's made several videos speaking out against movements like Christian nationalism, but there is a movement, you see it especially with people like Jordan Peterson, Ben Shapiro, Sam Harris, Douglas Murphy. And this movement, I don't want to call it like Western superiority, but the claims here is that Western civilization is somehow unique, distinct, and different, whether we're talking about morally, economically speaking, technologically speaking, scientifically speaking, that there is something distinctive about Western values, is the key word, that make the West, and then typically by proxy Christianity, somehow special, unique, or separate from other regions, religions, things like that. But the problem that I want to point out here is it's not really clear exactly what we mean by Western civilization, especially if we're going to make claims like Christianity caused Western civilization. So if by Western civilization we mean the geographical area around the Mediterranean in modern day countries like Greece, Italy, France, if that's what we mean by Western civilization, well, of course, civilizations in those regions dramatically predate Christianity. Christianity is something that comes on the scene much later. So I think we need some clarification there in terms of what we mean by Western civilization. And I'm not quite sure what that term is doing for this conversation, but I'm going to leave that be and let's get back to the whole slavery thing. So David is actually going to push back a little bit against Michael here. And that's kind of what I want to turn to now, and Michael's response to David's pushback.
Argument about slavery. I would say that the Christians who were abolitionists were doing that in spite of their religion. Like they were like pushing back against years and years and years of justification because of the Bible. That's like factually true, right?
Okay, so there's a lot of things that we need to parse out here. And I guess this is the philosopher in me that's coming out. But to begin with, we really need to define what exactly we mean when we're talking about slavery. And the reason why I say that is because slavery has, and we'll get to this in Michael's response, slavery has existed in many forms throughout the history of humanity. And so it's unclear in this conversation, because we keep oscillating back and forth between ancient forms of slavery and modern forms of slavery, exactly what we're talking about. But David's point here is that these people who were Christian abolitionists were abolitionists in spite of their Christianity. In other words, if we're talking about modern nations, and we're talking about modern forms of slavery in nations like Spain, France, and England, these were predominantly Christian nations. And in those nations, Christianity was used to justify the slavery that took place. So David's point is, I think, well, that's well and good, but Christianity is to some extent responsible for this slavery that we're talking about. Now, let's get Michael's response before I give you my response.
Not sure what you entirely mean, because slavery was the standard norm throughout, civilizations up until basically Christian Europe started pushing back against.
Okay, so this is exactly what I'm talking about. So yes, to Michael's points. Now there's a few things going on here, and I want to be really careful about how I phrase this. So on the one hand, if we just take what Michael's saying at face value, yes, slavery in one form or another has existed throughout human history in almost every civilization. I can't think of a single civilization in which slavery didn't exist. On the other hand, though, This is a argument and a phrase that's been used by people. Specifically, I have in mind here Candace Owens in the video that she made for Prager University regarding the history of American slavery. This phrase that slavery has always existed is sometimes used, and I'm not saying that this is what Michael's doing because there's no indication that he does this in this conversation, but this phrase has often been used to downplay or diminish what we see in the form of modern slavery, specifically American slavery. So I want to clarify here, yes, slavery has existed, but what we see with modern slavery, and by modern, I'm talking about 15th to 19th century slavery, and I'm talking about the institution of slavery that was implemented by colonial powers such as France, England, and Spain, specifically in the New World, is radically different from the forms of ancient slavery that we see and observe. There are a few exceptions to that. The biggest difference is that when we're talking about modern slavery, we're talking about a form of racialized chattel slavery. I have an entire video about the history of slavery if you're interested in it. But in the ancient world, when we talk about slavery, we're typically talking about two different forms of slavery, either debt slavery or slavery that's a result of warfare. And if you look at civilizations like Greek and Roman civilizations, there were actually rules and laws with respect to how you could treat slaves. But chattel slavery is something entirely different, mostly for the reason that I just mentioned, because with chattel slavery, with modern slavery, we're talking about the targeting of a specific group of people. Now, in the New World, the Spanish and the Portuguese will, of course, try to enslave the Native Americans. That doesn't work out for a lot of reasons. Again, referencing back to my video, go check it out. But modern slavery becomes wholly associated with a form of racialized slavery because we're talking about the enslavement of Africans, and we're talking about the forced removal of millions of Africans. This is the largest slave trade that's ever happened and impacted the most amount of people. The forceful movement of people from one geographical location, specifically the east coast of Africa, to another geographical location, the Americas. And these people were singled out because of their blackness. I mean, that was a big reason why they were chosen as slaves. There's a great book called Born in Blackness I would highly recommend that talks about the history of slavery if you're interested. But on top of that, within the countries like the United States that develop in the New World, this is a form of slavery that is institutionalized, meaning that it's written into law that African Americans, that Black people were to be slaves, and written into law that they were regulated to second-class citizens. You don't really see that in the ancient world, maybe with the exception of Spartan slavery was maybe a form of chattel slavery, but you don't see it to that level. So comparing ancient slavery to modern slavery is really apples and oranges comparison. We're not really talking about the same thing. So I would caution Michael to be careful with the sort of language that he uses here, especially as this is language that's been picked up by nationalists such as Candace Owens and used as a means to downplay, for purely political reasons, to downplay the history of slavery in the United States. All right, back to Michael.
Here's one thing I always ask people. I mean, I can look at historians like Samuel Moyn, Tom Holland, the book Christianity and Human Rights, an Introduction, where every chapter is a different author, edited by John Witt. And what I find a lot of historians saying is that Christianity was crucial for ending slavery. It very much was. It's not the only factor that led to the end of slavery, but it was crucial in a lot of ways. How is it that if the Bible is pro-slavery, why is it the book that was crucial for ending slavery?
Oh, I would push back. It's not the book that was instrumental. It was the Christians.
Okay, so the last point I want to focus on is Michael's question here. If the Bible is pro-slavery, why was it crucial in ending slavery? So I think what's happening in the context of this conversation is we get a bit of a false dichotomy that is formed between Michael and David, I think kind of indirectly, in which David is saying that the Bible justifies slavery and Michael is saying that the Bible is leading to the abolitionist movement, to the end of slavery. The whole point I want to make, and I've made this point in other videos, is that the answer to this dilemma is that it's both. History is insanely complicated and messy, and sometimes within history, people who are of the same ideological beliefs hold contradictory views regarding the same moral issue. And in the case of slavery, that is most certainly the case. If you look, for example, at the justifications and the reasons for slavery, the cultural reasons that were given in the American South, in the United States, these were religious justifications. And these were religious justifications that were taken from the Bible. When I teach American history, I sometimes allow my students to read sermons that were given in the South that talk about the benefits of slavery and the right of people to own slaves. And as David pointed out in those sermons, the passages that they're using are from books like Deuteronomy, which talks about laws for people to own slaves. At the same time, the abolitionists who object to the practice of slavery are also drawing from the Bible. So my point here is that it's a both and rather than an either or. Christianity is both, historically speaking, utilized as a justification for slavery. That point is historically undeniable. Case in point is Southern culture that was overtly Christian and overtly in support of the institution of slavery in the American South. And at the same time, Christianity is the foundation for the abolitionist movement, people like John Brown and gradual reformers. Even if you look at like the speeches of Abraham Lincoln later on in the 1860s, it's going to be drawing from similar places. Now, this is the big point I want to raise here, and the reason why I made a video about this in the first place, going back to my explanation that it's a both and. Because to Michael's point, yes, Christianity is responsible for the abolitionist movement, but Christian justifications are also at the root of the modern slave trade. The nations who began their colonial exploitation in the 15th and the 16th century were overtly Christian. The Spanish, who brutalized the native population of South and North America, were doing so under the banner of Christianity. French and English people who forcefully exported slaves from Africa to the New World were doing so under the assumption that they were bringing those people into a Christian nation. And the other point I want to say here, and I don't think that Michael would deny this, is that there are abolitionist movements that are rooted in non-Western, non-Christian traditions, both in the ancient world and in the modern world. In the ancient world, we have the 6th century Athenian, the famous politician Solon. Solon famously abolished debt slavery in Athens, and he freed all of the slaves who were in Athens at the time. Solon was not a Christian. We also have the Indian Emperor Ashoka, who once he took the throne, abolished the slave trade in India in the 3rd century, 2nd century BCE. Don't quote me on that. 2nd century BCE, I believe it was. Ashoka famously Buddhist. But we also have to remember that the people who are resisting slavery in the modern period, who are not coming from those Western countries, didn't support slavery. Native Americans didn't want to be slaves. The Africans that were forcefully captured didn't want to be slaves. Okay, that was the larger point I wanted to make there. Please feel free to argue with me in the chat. Let me know how you thought the conversation went, and I will see all of you next time.